Tom, thank you so much for joining me today at Risk Minds Americas. I know you're talking about conducting compliance a lot in your job, but how is this community just combining with the risk community? What's the future of this?
Yeah, I have an interesting perspective. One of my first presentations was in 2017 at Risk Minds, and at that time, I think there was more siloed isolation between sort of this discussion about risk, compliance, and conduct. It was not clear who owns what with the conduct space because that's more qualitative, whereas compliance and risk, we have our metrics, our KPIs, our KRIs, and conduct now is much more of a discussion with the regulators and the banks, and there's more data around that. But I think what we're seeing today is there's still a big data focus when you also have to get anecdotes from the front line, what's going on, what's happening, and combining it together with data. I call it anecdata. So looking at both, like you can't just rely on the data, like you might with compliance. You also have to look at the anecdotes if you're trying to figure out what the conduct is. So that's important, no matter what your role is, to look at both.
Yeah. So, as you say, with regulatory interest in employee conduct, how is this transition to this data-led approach happening, and what's the future of that?
Yeah, so I think there's much more. So with compliance, it's more legal focused, like can we do something? And conduct is more about should we make this decision? And again, it's harder to quantify. But I think if you look at, there's two types of ethics I talk about when I do a training session. There's sort of normative ethics, which is what we're taught in ethics class in university. Like, is this the right or wrong thing to do? But there's also descriptive ethics, like how would our stakeholders look at this? How would society look at these decisions we're making? And we're seeing more of a push there to more of that descriptive ethics when we're talking about conduct. And again, it's qualitative. So some of my clients have trouble pitching their board on investing in this and looking at this because if it's qualitative, if we can't measure it, we're not going to go after it. So I think we're on a good path with this, but there's still a lot of work to do in terms of getting our arms around like what is the conduct risk in our organizations. But if you think about it more in terms of like, should we do something versus can we do something? I think that helps a lot. But thinking about what is conduct risk.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, so what is the missing link here with leadership buy-in then?
Yeah, I think when I present with boards, they're always sort of metric focused and committees and looking at the data. When going back, not to repeat myself, but just like looking at the anecdotes and the data. And I think boards just have to get comfortable with that to help them make decisions or invest in certain vendors in terms of looking at this more because regulators are focused on it and regulators are going to keep focusing on this. I think it's just boards have to get comfortable with not everything's going to be there in the data set for you to look at. Like you have to have a little bit of both.
Yeah, of course. But with trends moving towards things like personal liability, especially in the sustainable finance area and green finance area, how can risk professionals and senior leadership people kind of prepare for that, and what's the solution here?
Yeah, and I think risk culture has evolved too in the last 7 years since I'm presenting, where now it's more about, I look at risk culture as like how do you manage risk, not the what, but how you're doing it. So again, looking at organizations, are they too siloed? Sometimes I'll present to a bank and like risk is doing its own thing and compliance is doing its own thing and they're not talking. So how siloed are you? Are you talking to your other departments and having sort of a cohesive view of the business, of the risk culture? I think about, there's organizational culture we talk a lot about, which is like using a family analogy, the parents. There's the conduct risk, which might be the little brother who gets in trouble. And then there's the risk culture, which is the older sibling who's trying to hold it both together. So I think it's important just to not be in siloed organizations, be talking to your counterparts in other departments to get a handle on like what is the risk culture, how do we make decisions, how do we analyze our decision making, because decisions lead to the conduct risk. And if you just think good decisions deliver good outcomes, that's not right, because good decisions can deliver bad outcomes. So look at your outcomes and look at your decision making, and you'll start to sort of predict what the conduct risk might be.
And of course, coming up is Risk Minds International, where you'll be also presenting, where we also have a separate track for conduct and compliance risk. What do you expect to? What themes do you expect to come up in this?
So yeah, it's interesting. In Europe, I get a lot more questions about this than the U.S. Maybe it's just because the regulators there, like the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, was sort of at the forefront of the conduct discussion when I started speaking 7-8 years ago, and the U.S. regulators were sort of behind. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus on these types of questions. What are regulators looking for? What do they expect? I define culture today in my presentation as the behaviors employees believe will put them ahead. So we often hear it's the tone at the top. To me, it's not the tone. The tone is just a signal. It doesn't mean anything, but it's actually, do you understand the behaviors that drive incentives or the behaviors that employees believe will put them ahead? And the more people can do that within the banks and the financial institutions, I think the regulators will be, not to say that they would be happier, but at least think you're on the right path. So I think we'll have a really robust discussion, maybe debate about how to look at that today.
And of course, it's all to do with co-working and collaborating across all these places.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it all comes together that way.
Yeah. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.